Hello, I am Bjorn, movie archaeologist, and welcome back to the Temple of Movie Reviews. Today, the movie I am reviewing is a very interesting one. It's a kind of controversial movie in my opinion. I have a lot to say about it. That movie is, of course, Boogeyman, the new Stephen King short story adaptation. And this one turned out to be quite interesting. Now, there will be a major spoiler section in here, but I actually recommend that people who haven't seen the movie sit through to the spoiler section because I'm going to talk about some things this movie does, and I'll get more into that right before the spoiler section, that I found to be, I guess for lack of a better word, potentially scandalous. Some things I noticed about the movie that I haven't seen anyone else comment on that I feel I should flesh, grievances with the film. About the actual content, not about the actual content of the movie, but about the content of the movie. I'll get into that when we get to it. So for now, I'm just going to talk about what's actually in the movie, what I actually thought of the actual film itself as a movie. And on that front, I thought it was okay. It was a 7 out of 10. I'll go ahead and spoiler. Maybe a 6.5, something like that. The movie itself centers around a family with a father and 2 young girls who believe there's a monster living in their closet that is coming out and tormenting them. They think it wants to kill them, but other people, have some differing opinions on what it is. The father, who's a psychiatrist, seems to think that there's nothing wrong at all. And the whole film turns into a sort of kids see the monster torments them in the halls. Dad doesn't believe in the monster until Dad believes in the monster, and then characters have to fight monster. And there's an attempt at a moral in the movie. I guess you could call it a theme on grief that's all throughout the movie. And in that way, the movie is kind of interesting. The discussion of grief is interesting, if a little ham-fisted. I feel like near the end of the movie that moral sort of falls flat. It didn't work for me that well. Some of the decisions made near the end of the movie sort of fall out of the metaphor and into reality of the film too much for the metaphor to work. It sort of like undoes parts of the metaphor. If you've seen the movie, you'll kind of get what I'm getting at with that, I think. Beyond that, there's some pretty effective, creepy moments in the film. There's some stuff in it that's fairly eerie. Some moments that are unsettling. A lot of jump scares, I noticed, which I don't like jump scares, so whatever. But for every jump scare, there was an equal sort of creepy, normal shot. There are some unsettling images. The monster is pretty creepy. Some of the stuff in that works pretty well. There's some creative shots, I guess. The use of light to frighten the monster leads to some cool, if predictable shots. All in all, I would say the movie was sort of predictable. Made doubly so by my issue with the movie for me. And almost everything that was going to happen I sort of saw coming. They introduced a Chekhov's gun. I imagined exactly how that was going to be used, and sure enough, I was right. They show a thing. I imagined exactly how that's going to be used, and sure enough, I'm absolutely correct again. And there's a lot of that all throughout the film. So I felt like, it was just very predictable, I guess I would say. And anytime I thought maybe they would do something interesting, like there's a moment where the monster almost kills a character, and then it doesn't, and it wasn't nearly as interesting. Everything that happened I could sort of see coming. So that's going to bring me to my spoiler section. Now, as I mentioned before, if you have seen the movie or haven't seen the movie, I still recommend you watch this part. I'll try to avoid specific spoilers where I can, but there is something I need to talk about, and that is specifically that I came out of this movie with the feeling that it was extremely, extremely similar to, if not outright plagiarized from another movie. And that movie is The Babadook, which was very popular in 2014 when it came out. I saw it. I loved The Babadook. It really resonated with me, and I've seen it several times since. So when I sat through this movie, it immediately jumped out to me as being super similar to The Babadook. Now, I do my due diligence. I did my homework, at least vaguely, quickly, before I sat down to make this review. And the first thing I checked was the Stephen King short story. The first thought in my mind was, maybe The Babadook was inspired by the Stephen King short story. And on a cursory look, the Stephen King short story came out in 1973. That's it. The Babadook read the short story and plagiarized it. And so I was like, okay, that makes sense. Sure, whatever. And then I decided to dig a little deeper. I read a synopsis of the short story in question, which has nothing to do with this movie. The short story involves Lester, who's seen briefly in this movie, played by David Deschamel, I think, maybe that's how you say it. He's the guy who plays Polka Dot Man. He goes to the psychiatrist and is like, hey, my children were killed by a boogeyman, and I believe in it now, and you have to believe in it. And in the short story, he goes in, he tells them what happens, he talks about the boogeyman preying on their children, and then he leaves, and then goes back to ask a question and realizes that the psychiatrist he was talking to was the Boogeyman. Now, I didn't read the short story, so it might not go exactly like that, but that sounds sort of silly. That being said, everything else that's in this movie then is not from the short story. The themes of grief, the idea of the monster being in, like, the closet. I guess they mentioned the monster being in the closet in the short story briefly, but and that's where the similarities to the Babadook begin, because this movie is extremely similar to the Babadook to a concerning degree. The Babadook stars a young mother and her child. The mother is dealing with the grief of her husband who died in a car accident. The movie I just saw, Boogeyman, features a young father and his two children dealing with the grief of their mother who just died in a car accident. In both films, a young child becomes convinced that they are seeing a monster which lives in their closet, is made of shadows, and comes out and is planning to kill them. They both use light, if I remember correctly. It's been a while since I've seen the Babadook, but I'm pretty sure this is correct. Uses light to scare away the Babadook. This movie leans way more into the light thing, so that could almost be excused. Like, it's not an uncommon thing to think your nightlight keeps the monster away. Both films personify the monster as a figment of grief and use it as the character overcoming the monster, the character overcoming their grief. Again, this is super similar to the Babadook, and you might think, well, that sounds not that similar, but it really is, especially in the way it's executed. Both movies feature one of the children going down to the basement to look at the box of their parents' things after they've died, again, in a car wreck. This movie has the exact same thing. Both movies feature the Babadook or the Boogeyman climbing up on a ceiling and frightening a character by clinging there. Both movies, again, this one's really vague because, like, I mean, this is like barely a connection, but in the Babadook, the little boy sets up booby traps that are triggered to fire when the monster hits a tripwire, if I recall. And in this movie, a character does the same thing. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. Obviously, the tone of both those sequences are very different, so I'll give the movie a pass on that. Both movies feature a person seeing the monster on a piece of paper to become convinced that it's real. In the Babadook, it is a picture book, and in this, it's a drawing of the creature made by the child of the man who goes to the psychiatrist. Both movies feature someone defeating the Babadook in a basement in the Babadook, in a basement in this, albeit the situation is very different. Both movies have the characters overcoming their grief, and in fact, both movies end with the character locking the monster away. In this movie, the girl locks it in a closet in the psychiatrist's office when it tries to kill her, symbolizing that she's moved past her grief. And in the Babadook, the mother keeps it locked in the basement and feeds it very occasionally, but won't let it hurt her anymore because she's also come over her grief. Again, extremely similar. And these could just be coincidences. I've said that. This could be an accident. Great minds thinking alike. It's happened to me before. I've seen this happen. So that could be it. But I found it very concerning. And at the very least, it definitely took away from my enjoyment of the film. Watching it, all I could think was just how similar the movie was to the Babadook, even the way the monster moves in the Babadook. And this goes without saying, but the Babadook is a better movie. It's better executed in that movie. So if you want to watch this or the Babadook, I recommend the Babadook. It's on probably Amazon Prime. It's somewhere. It's a great movie. It's made by an Australian director. It's an indie movie, which I kind of get the vibe this wasn't, because this has a lot to CGI. Big CGI monster. The subtlety of the costume of the Babadook is kind of lost in this. So, at the very least, the movies are extremely similar. Maybe this was definitely inspired by the Babadook. I would feel confident if you were to ask the director, they would say this was inspired by the Babadook. But to me, it goes even beyond that. And I could be very wrong. I've said this again. I want to keep reiterating this, because if the director comes and contacts me and is like, hey, it was a coincidence or whatever, I'll take him at his word. But there was just a lot of things in this that, to me, they were just super, super similar. They had the same theme. It was just a movie about someone learning to overcome their grief, which is personified by a shadow monster that lives in a little boy's closet. Oh, I don't know if I mentioned that. The Babadook comes out of the little boy's closet in the Babadook, and he hides under his bed. And the Babadook, I think it even goes under his bed at one point. And this, again, I mean, monsters hiding in the closet, not that common, but it's the combination of all of these things that were super similar. The Babadook came out in 2014. Stephen King's short story had nothing to do with this movie, really, once I looked into it. Outside of the idea of there being a boogeyman that lives in the closet and the psychiatrist who isn't even the main character in the short story. So, yeah, I suspect they were got the rights to the Stephen King short story, and they had this idea, and they were like, well, how do we make this more interesting? And either someone in the production team suggested the idea of tackling grief and wound up accidentally remaking the Babadook, or someone saw the Babadook, thought, oh, that's a good idea, and then lightly copied their homework, but changed it up just a bit. That's sort of what it felt like. Again, this movie was just a less subtle version of the Babadook. It was more of a popcorn horror movie, so they're not really targeting the same audience or trying to achieve the same things. They were just very similar to me, and I couldn't help but notice it. So that's really all. Those are my thoughts on the movie. As a movie, I would give it a 6.5 or a 7 out of 10. That other stuff, I don't know how I feel about it, because again, I don't know what happened. I don't know the people involved. These are just things I just thought were odd, that I thought I would point out, that I thought might be nefarious or might not be. I couldn't really say. I will say the poster I got leaving the theater was sick. Great poster. Whoever did the art for that, kick-ass stuff. Keep it up. The acting was all fine. Visuals all fine. Some cool use of lighting, I guess. But besides that, a little bit generic, I would say. There was like 1 or 2 shots I would say were kind of interesting, but they were few and far between. So I don't know. Yeah. So that being said, thanks for watching. If you all saw this movie and you saw the Babadook, do you agree with me? Do you think I'm stretching? I would be very keen to hear, because I would like to know if this was just me or if other people noticed the same sort of thought process as me. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Comment below, tell me what you thought, yada yada. Turn on notification bell, engage with the content. Alright, I'm Bjorn, movie archaeologist. Dialogue. I'm going back into the temple, something. Alright, I'll see you all in the next one.